I'd like to tell you a little story about my experience with one of Frictional's previous games, Penumbra Overture. This is going somewhere, so bear with me. I bought the game in 2008 with the intention of playing it right away and reviewing it. I played it for about 90 minutes and then set it aside, telling myself that I'll focus on other games. The time just isn't right for a Penumbra review because, I'll just play it later. 6 months later, I did exactly the same thing. I downloaded it, I replayed the first 90 minutes, and then I set it aside. The time just wasn't right for a Penumbra Overture review. There were other games to be played. The same thing happened again, another 6 months later. The Penumbra review would just have to wait, I would tell myself. I have other games to play. But I was lying to myself. The truth is, I was too afraid to play it. I think probably the greatest compliment you can pay to a horror game is refusing to play it out of fear. In that respect, Penumbra Overture, at least for me, stands beside Silent Hill and System Shock 2. Clearly, the game is in good company. And while this review has forced me to play Amnesia, I can tell you for a certain fact that if I didn't have those slavers' whips lashing me on, I would have uninstalled Amnesia after 90 minutes and curled up in my bed and just cried. Because Amnesia is fucking scary, but in a way that many people probably won't be used to. Frictional never delivers a single cheap scare because their horror isn't about set pieces or startling you. It isn't about zombie dogs jumping through windows. Frictional's horror is all about making you feel utterly helpless. And it's the kind of sensation that lingers, pervading throughout almost the entire game. Almost never will you feel safe, and never will you feel confident, making it a very emotionally draining, exhausting experience. You play as an Englishman named Daniel, and you're in some dilapidated, abandoned Eastern European castle. As the title may suggest, the game uses that old chestnut Amnesia as a framing device for the story. The story is not complex exactly, but it's not told linearly, and there are at least two separate but connected stories told simultaneously. The game uses a few storytelling devices. There are flashbacks, though these flashbacks are just audio, and there are written documents and written documents with voice acting, which you might call audio logs. There are also snippets of text during the loading screens. All of this makes it a little hard to follow, particularly as these stories are told simultaneously, and if you happen to miss a few documents you'll probably be utterly baffled. But it definitely is interesting, and while it's not the best story you'll ever experience, it does its job well enough. If you've ever played a Penumbra game, you can know what to expect from Amnesia. It's basically Penumbra 2, which is to say that it's a survival horror game with some light logic and physics puzzles, and some item collection. But it's not a survival horror in the way that Resident Evil is a survival horror. It's not even a survival horror in the way that Silent Hill is a survival horror. This is survival horror as it truly should be. You don't have any weapons. Your only survival tools are your feet, which you use to run away and hide, like a little girl. There's no fighting, there's no killing, there's just surviving. This is what makes the game so frightening. Fear, the emotion, is a mechanism to keep you alive. It's directly connected to, amongst other things, your perception of danger, which is in turn intrinsically linked to your sense of vulnerability. Vulnerable equals danger equals fear. And as I said, Amnesia leaves you feeling utterly helpless, leaves you feeling extremely vulnerable. That makes every enemy in the game an enormous threat, which makes the whole game shit your pants scary. And the game doesn't just throw real threats at you, it throws perceived threats at you too. Those threats that aren't actually there, but you think they're there, meaning that even when enemies aren't actually around, you'll still be hiding from them like a little girl. This perception of danger is created, as with all good horror games, through sound and the absence of light. Darkness really is the crux of the game. Most of the game is quite poorly lit, and you'll spend your time wandering around in pitch black darkness, wondering if you're going to run head first into a monster that you can't fight in any way. By partially removing your sight, one of only two senses we enjoy in computer games, you're left feeling even more helpless. And then the game assaults you with sounds, from the quite distressing whimpering of some girl locked up somewhere in the castle, to the ominous footsteps of something shuffling around on the floor above you. And when you can hear something, but you can't see it, your brain starts fucking with you. And this is already on top of the knowledge that you're at the absolute bottom of the food chain in the castle. I was not joking when I said it's an emotionally draining experience. And your health isn't the only thing you need to keep tabs on. There's also your mental health, much like in Dark Corners of the Earth. There are certain scripted moments throughout the game that, yes, are shock scares, and I think you all know what I think of shock scares by now, but they also drain your sanity. Seeing a door open by itself or a bunch of skulls topple out of a desk drawer is going to make you nuts, but far more significant is that standing in darkness will also make you nuts. So where Penumbra Overture had a very slow, very brooding, very deliberate pace as you shuffle around in the darkness, Amnesia has a much faster pace. It doesn't give you time to think as you struggle to that next light source, which keeps you permanently on edge until you're standing in the light. And even when you're safe and happy in the light, you know that you've got to go back out into the darkness and face whatever's out there, or perhaps not out there. Light doesn't actually restore sanity, it just prevents sanity drain, which means that you can't cheat and set the gamma rate up like you could in Penumbra, which allowed you to see without using the limited light sources in the game. As in Amnesia, you'll be losing sanity either way. You really do need those light sources. Speaking of light sources, this gives rise to what you might call Amnesia's most prominent gameplay element, the hunt for resources. You can collect tinderboxes to light candles, and you also carry an oil lamp, but the lamp requires oil to work, which is also a finite resource. This means you're going to spend a large portion of the game exploring every nook and cranny looking for tinderboxes and oil, so you can create your own light sources. This exploration in and of itself is not exactly a good gameplay element, but it plays very well with the horror aspect of the game, and seeing your tinderboxes run out and your oil drain away feels like watching your lifeblood pumping out of a wound. You're witnessing your gradual, but absolutely inevitable death as your resources drain away. Resource collection and conservation is a staple of horror games, and Frictional has handled it very well in Amnesia. To actually restore your sanity, you have to make progress throughout the game. Figuring out how to open a trapdoor or set an explosive is a pretty weird way to make someone sane, but it works. You'll mostly make progress through puzzles. The puzzles are very simple, but unlike traditional survival horror games, they do at least feel believable. You might be throwing something at an object to smash it, pulling secret books out of a bookcase to open a secret passage, or removing a blockage from a mechanism. It's no mist, and the game really babies you through the notes or flashbacks, which pretty thoroughly explain what to do most of the time. But the puzzles serve their purpose, pacing and exploration, pretty well. As with the Penumbra series, you can pick up and directly manipulate objects, which is absolutely one of the highlights of the game. To open a desk drawer, for instance, you need to target the drawer, hold your mouse button to grab hold of it, and then drag backwards on the mouse. This, at least for me, makes every single door in the game an ordeal. In other survival horror games, you might dread what might be on the other side of the door, but all you have to do is build up the courage to press the open door button. Once you've done that, your job is done, and you're waiting to see how the game responds. In Amnesia, as with the Penumbra series, you have to grab hold of the door and open it yourself by dragging the mouse. Apart from a few doors that have loading screens associated with them, you're in total control of whether or not the door opens, and it takes a sustained force of will to get it open. I frequently found myself opening doors a crack, and peering through for what might have been a few minutes before I finally found the resolve to leave the safety of whatever room I was hiding in. The object manipulation is awesome, but it gives rise to a real problem I have with the game. You don't have hands. This was fine back during the days of Half-Life 2 or the original Penumbra Overture. Seeing those objects that you're ostensibly holding floating around in front of you, it was pretty easy to overlook. But I find it hard to overlook it today, and the fact that you can twist and rotate objects in your hands just draws attention to it. I know they're an indie developer and we shouldn't expect too much from them, but the next step for this kind of technology absolutely has to be visible hands. Frictional has created what is otherwise such an immersive experience, and you have hands while holding your oil lamp, but that you have no visible body whatsoever the rest of the time undermines the immersive feel of the game. Although they are an indie developer, Frictional has made a gorgeous game. I said earlier that the hunt for items isn't exactly the best gameplay device, but along with playing well with the horror, the beautiful visuals make it almost a pleasure. All of the areas are finely detailed, and it looks and feels a lot like an actual castle. If this is what indie games look like today, who needs mainstream games? But the sounds are even better. They do a perfect job of making you utterly paranoid, and the music is almost on par with Akira Yamaoka's, particularly during the Water Stalker sequence, which I have deliberately not mentioned. The secondary voice talent is perfectly acceptable, but I have a problem with the main character. Throughout the entire game, he sounds like he's reading an audiobook. He's not convincing or believable in any way. He just pisses me off, actually. With Frictional being Swedish, there are also quite a few grammatical errors or American spelling, which doesn't make much sense, but this is quite easy to excuse and overlook. On the topic of sound, there's also a developer's commentary. I confess I haven't really tried it out yet, but developer commentary is something I absolutely love to see in games, so it's a fantastic bonus. 20 years ago, Infogrames was the king of horror. 10 years ago, it was Konami. But today, it is unquestionably Frictional. Amnesia has an extremely oppressive, frightening atmosphere, and the game manipulates your emotions in an extremely effective way. It has some problems, but the overall experience is consistently magnificent, and it's a game every horror fan should not be without. And as an aside, I have to say that in an age where practically every game ends up as some kind of shooter, it's pretty remarkable that this game exists at all.